There are moments in a life that arrive like an auctioneer's hammer, sudden, decisive, leaving a long trail of consequences that everyone else has to reckon with afterward. For Lucas Marshall, those moments began with champagne flutes raised above a skyline and a wager that was meant to amuse a room full of money and power. If this video speaks to you, stay until the end. Subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you don't miss the rest of our stories. The party was everything the press photographs promised. Crystal chandeliers, a soft hum of string quartet undercut by laughter, a terrace where the city unrolled like a map of impossible possibility. Lucas stood near a floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection a slimmer, polished twin, the Hudson a dark ribbon below. He had learned to read rooms the way others read weather. Tonight, the air favored him. He wore a suit cut to a geometry that made him look immovable. Around him, voices sought his attention in currency he accepted with a smile. "Bet you wouldn't do it," Jack said, the grin already forming around the daring. Jack was less a friend and more a social engine, someone whose enjoyment derived from testing the edges of people. He loved wagers that turned into stories. Lucas let the grin come slow. Do what? Marry a stranger for 6 months. $1 million if you make it real. Not a paper ceremony. Live with her. Public appearances, rings, the whole theater. You're dry for authenticity, Lucas. Show us you can make someone fall in line. The laugh around the circle was bright and easy. Lucas felt the arithmetic of it. Risk, spectacle, proof. He had built an empire on making odds look like inevitability. 1 million, he said, and the number landed like a sealed contract. They found Chloe Richards at a table by the band, watching, not dancing. She was not the usual kind of woman at these events. No one whispered about her wardrobe or who she knew. She had a handful of peonies on the table beside her, a small, deliberate touch that made her look untouchably human. When Lucas approached, she looked up with an expression that did not immediately register interest, and that was precisely the point. Their agreement was clinical at first, because both of them came to the table with contracts of their own. Chloe listened while Jack described the wager with the theatrical cruelty of someone who had never been the injured party. She said yes on 3 conditions: 6 months, full autonomy the entire time, no public constraints on her movement, a clause that ensured she would leave if she wished, and payment placed in escrow to be directed where she chose at the end. The last condition was the thinnest tether between her and the game. She insisted on a freedom clause, a physical and legal paper that would prevent the marriage from becoming a cage. Lucas agreed because he loved seeing the world bend. He loved to
win. He also believed he knew the terms of power, possession, display, control. He did not then fully comprehend the moral geometry he was about to enter. The first nights were a study in collision. Lucas saw the marriage as performance at first. Dinners, a public appearance with Chloe at his arm, headlines that were equal parts lust and curiosity. He set the penthouse as their home. Glass that drank the city light, a chessboard in the parlor with ivory pieces he often found himself arranging when conversation wavered. Chloe kept her rituals that seemed almost ordinary against his high opulous backdrop: strong black coffee, tea brewed with a careful measured hand. The peonies moved to different corners depending on her mood. She was resolutely herself. She read, she went to work, she made appointments and kept them. She resisted the pattern Lucas expected. She refused to be rearranged. That resistance became, for him, an irritation first and then a challenge. He began to test boundaries in ways that felt small until they did not. He controlled calendars, redirected invitations, scheduled meetings so that he could be present, and then made disappearing decisions on her behalf. He meant, in his mind, to secure the success of their public image. What he had not considered was how his control ate at the fragile rest Chloe had insisted on protecting with her freedom clause. He thought of his moves as strategic, shifting a knight to corner an opponent. She experienced them as an erosion. Chloe's response was surgical, patient. She refused to dramatize. When his people suggested he escalate, undermine her, make her more dependent, she replied with small acts of undermining that were humane and precise. A quietly canceled interview at just the right time, an email to a mutual contact that highlighted a different perspective, a schedule conflict that made a sponsor doubt logistics. She did not humiliate him in public. She forced his influence to fail in the ordinary mechanisms he relied upon. Projects he had touted as bulletproof began to wobble. Sponsors reconsidered. A small chain of bookstores that Lucas had pressured into a deal in an attempt to silence dissent folded months later with excuses about the market. No headlines blamed him personally. Ruin made its path through neighborhoods and numbers, not through his social page. But Chloe, who had grown up with people ruined by deals like his, knew enough about dominoes to set one piece in motion. She had a reason that was not vengeance for its own sake. On a rainy Tuesday, she let him know, in a room that smelled of coffee and lemon soap, who she truly was. It was not the theatrical confession of a woman on a mission. It was a steady, low-slung telling. "My father had a small company," she said. "He made things people needed. He didn't want to be on your kind of map, but he did okay, until he didn't. Contracts were called, payments were delayed, investors were convinced there was risk where there wasn't. Hadn't been. He lost the work that paid for the mortgage, for the school books, for the medication for Mom. The numbers didn't go from good to bad overnight. They dimmed like a light bulb, one after the other. There was shame, then panic. He left notes. He chose to stop." She put her hands around the handle of her mug like an anchor. She did not ask him to confess. She did not seek an apology. She spoke as though stating facts. Lucas felt the air leave him in a small, sudden way, like someone had opened a window in a sealed room. "You were involved," she said, "not by name, but by the process. Your firm's methods, your choices, pushed others into taking harder positions. He was not a headline. He was a father who vanished from the photos." Lucas's mind offered him defenses, legal distance, plausible deniability. He had never, in the math of ledgers, met the man who had been reduced to less than he was. The abstraction of profit had always had a smooth, clean face to him. It did not show the places where it nicked and bled. Chloe's voice made the nick visible. The first part of her revelation landed like a stone. The second took longer to land because it was quieter and more intimate, wrapped in a hush he recognized as grief. "I was pregnant the year after he died," she said one winter evening when the skyline beyond their glass was a set of white lights. "I lost it when everything started to shift again, when I had to take on 3 jobs, when the banks called, when my mother cried at night and refused to let me see the worst bills. It wasn't one reason. It was 100 small reasons stacking on someone who had nowhere to fall." She did not say the word miscarriage at first. She said lost, which was both softer and heavier. Lucas felt the syllable lodge in the part of his chest that had always been used to ordering rooms and people into shapes that pleased him. He had been engrossed in proving a point to men who bet for sport. In the margins of his own life, a human being had been dismantled. After she spoke, she sat with him and let credibility and pain have their honest conversation. She described her daughter that would not be. Small things, like the name she had liked, the way she'd imagined teaching the child to make tea. The detail could have been private, but Chloe gave it into the room as though testing him. She needed to know whether anyone across from her could bear witness. Lucas's first impulse was to apologize. Then he found that apology could not land as words meant anything while the ledger still looked balanced in his mind. He could say sorry and walk away. He could also open his checkbook and mark the slot for restitution. Chloe did not take money to undo what had been done. That was not how she measured justice. The months that followed were defined by a collapse that began in Lucas as a loss of equilibrium. Failure came slowly at first, in the market. Projects delayed, partnerships withered.
His public image, which had always been an armor as clean as the suits he wore, began to chip at the edges. He found himself spending more nights awake on the penthouse balcony than he had in years, staring at his mirrored reflection in the glass and recalculating. What had he become when his decisions could be traced to a father's absence and the possible loss of a child? Chloe kept her distance. She had agreed to the terms, but she had not bargained for the moral rot that would unspool in his orbit. Her acts of undermining remained measured, never cruel, never gratuitous, but they were persistent. She was careful to not be the caricature of a vengeful woman. She wanted him to see, to feel the consequence of what his kind of power did to ordinary people. When the inevitable public scrutiny circled, Lucas's first instinct was to protect the facade. He hired damage control. He made statements that had the sterile warmth of a man who knew how to craft remorse like a press release. But the story behind the headlines had faces and habits. A closed bakery that had once supplied his events with pastries, a small manufacturing shop that had not survived fierce buyout tactics, a mother who had had to sell the house where she kept her husband's photograph on the mantel. Those visits, knocking on doors in neighborhoods that smelled of fried food and dog parks, were what broke him. He had never been a man good at being small. He'd never before needed to offer his hands for work that would not be reflected in glossy magazine pages. The first time a woman opened a shuttered storefront to let him stand inside and look at the dust that had settled on her life, he realized that public apologies were not the currency that mattered. Presence was, listening was, time was. So he began the long, awkward work. It started as a compulsion. If he had a problem, he would fix it. He found himself at a kitchen table in a modest home, handing over checks with numbers he had never thought twice about, offering in-person apologies that felt clumsy at first because they were not statements written and vetted by counsel. He financed the reopening of one small fabrication business where a father once taught his son to weld. He sat through calls with distrusting bankers. He sat on stoops and listened to how families had tried and failed to keep their insurance afloat. He learned the shape of paperwork that saved people from eviction. Chloe watched, sometimes from a distance, sometimes in a chair at the table. She did not accept all his gestures. Some of them were too public, too performative. Another press conference where he stood in front of a banner, hands polished and tidy. Those she refused to encounter. For her, reparation had to be personal and persistent. She taught him the difference between buying goodwill and earning it. There were nights when Lucas's old reflexes rose, strategizing philanthropy like a merger, measuring return on investment in empathy. But slowly, repetitively, the arithmetic shifted. He met people who asked for nothing except steady contact. A widow needed a partner to navigate paperwork after losing a spouse. Lucas sat in the back row of a meeting room and listened as the woman spoke of dignity. A small community center that had relied on a meager grant found its lights turned back on because Lucas had pushed internally for funds he once would have diverted to a naming opportunity. Close-guardedness softened in increments that were not dramatic but precise. An extra day spent at a community meeting, the sharing of a small private grief, a visit to the grave where she left peonies that matched the ones she kept in the penthouse. She did not let forgiveness be a quick currency. It was a ledger of months. Presence, accountability, small humiliations accepted without spin. When she asserted that his work still lacked soul, she meant it as a test, not a condemnation. The day Lucas learned, in a way that could not be measured by balance sheets, that he had failed in the most personal of ways, came with the revelation Chloe had kept folded in like a letter she had been saving for the right year. Her words were compact and delivered with a flatness that made him listen harder. "There was a time I thought maybe I could let you move me," she said. "I thought the contract could be a path, but I was carrying the memory of a child I never got to hold. I carried anger shaped into tasks. I am sorry for what I did, but I could not pretend there was no harm done." Lucas felt the last of his previous defenses give way. What unfurled after that was not theatrical. It was real grief, his own, taking the shape of long conversations, therapy, the humbling work of learning how to be present for people without the automatic reflex of offering money as a salve.
He learned to sit in rooms without solving. It was, he discovered, one of the hardest things he had ever done. There was no magical absolution. Chloe watched for integrity more than for ceremony. When Lucas apologized in the way that mattered, by repeatedly failing and then trying again differently, she allowed him in gradually. Trust arrived like a slow bloom, not a headline. Months turned into a cleaner, steadier rhythm. Lucas sold off a small wing of a holding company he had once used to punish competitors. He redirected the proceeds into rebuilding businesses he had once undermined. Publicly, he took responsibility in a long-form essay that did not seek headlines, but instead told stories of people he had met. Privately, he battered through details. Loan arrangements restructured, hands-on hours at workshops, time spent teaching young entrepreneurs how to scale without sacrificing ethics. He learned a vocabulary of restitution, listening to families, funding mental health services, supporting school programs for the children affected by closures. Chloe watched him as she watched seasons change. She still had moments when she retreated, her rituals of black coffee and peonies never fully abandoned, but the space between them filled with small, ethical choices that were now regular. She let him show up without a camera rolling. She let him fumble and persist. On an overcast morning that felt like the end of one long winter, they stood at a low table in a courthouse where legality did the work of honoring what had become real rather than theatrical. This time, it was not a bet on a stage, but a real joining. No one in the room expected fireworks. The vows they spoke were not polished quotations, but statements of an intention to continue in hard work and love. Chloe placed a hand on his as the papers were signed, and the penthouse chessboard, which had once been a place he used to think in terms of winning, had a new place, a corner where they kept a bowl of peonies. A daughter came later, because life arranged itself in ways neither of them could have priced. She was a small bundle of mornings, an amalgam of Chloe's smile and Lucas's stubborn curiosity. The first time Lucas held her, it felt as if a new set of arbitration had opened in his chest, the kind that asked for patience more than spectacle. 5 years later, their daughter fell ill in a way that made the air around the family thin and sharp. It was a routine operation in the terms of most hospital hallways, a doctor who said, "We are optimistic," a nurse who folded a sticker into a child's palm as if it might anchor courage. But to them it felt like walking into a storm. You learn, in parenthood, that the illusions of control evaporate quickly. Lucas walked the hospital corridors in habits that had once been successful, phone calls arranged, private rooms, consultations. But a different kind of urgency moved him now, the primitive need to be simply present. They left the operating room and sat with the kind of time that is never measured evenly. Minutes stretched and contracted. Chloe's hands found the same cup she always carried. Lucas counted and lost track of the chessboard phrases in his head. The surgeon, who had been steady and human, came out and explained what he could. The operation had been successful in a clinical sense, he said, but children respond in ways adult language cannot always predict. When their daughter woke, she did so with the slow opacity of someone who had hoped to return to a room she reached for Chloe with a simplicity that erased months of guardedness. The little girl's eyes lingered on the light coming through the curtains as if she were naming it anew. Then she smiled in a way that did not feel staged. There was a widening of something beyond the expected tiredness of an anesthetized child. "Did you see anything?" Chloe whispered, half asking the nurses, but really asking the small new person who had been the center of everything. The daughter's voice came modest and peculiar. She described, in the blunt, crystalline manner of children who do not yet learn to hedge, a place that had no edges the way their penthouse windows did. She spoke of a field of light and someone with peonies in her hair who laughed like rain. She said the woman had hands that smelled like coffee and kindness. She said she had been shown a small table with a photograph on it where a man had been smiling and had told her he was sorry and that everything would be okay. Lucas felt the world recalibrate. The corners of the room held their breath. Chloe listened and slowly exhaled a sound that was equal parts recognition and sorrow. The child's words were a mirror without a reflection of intent. They were not proof of anything metaphysical. They were, instead, an honest, raw emotional compass that landed precisely in places both of them had worn thin. "What did she say about us?" Lucas asked, because he needed to know if the childish vision included a judgment about what he had been. Chloe hesitated, then set the small patient's hand in her own. "She said we were learning how to be gentle," she reported, tears forming but not spilling. The phrase was a kind of verdict that required no absolution, a task rather than a forgiveness. The daughter's message did something quiet and seismic. It did not erase what had come before: the father who had closed his shop, the months of calculated resistance, the loss they had both carried. Instead, it reoriented them. The image of a woman with peonies and coffee in her hands anchored Chloe's grief into something tender rather than bitter. The photograph of a smiling man in the little table the girl described, did it belong to Chloe's father imagined in a kinder light, or was it a child's way of assembling peace? The ambiguity was part of what made the message matter. In the weeks after the surgery, the small phrase, "We are learning how to be gentle," became a lodestar. Lucas began to understand gentleness not as a softness that cost him reputation, but as a discipline that could be practiced. He showed up to meetings and deferred to partners who had less polished voices. He worked with Chloe to design programs that did not only give money, but taught steady business management to families who had been burned by the kind of mergers and acquisitions he once orchestrated. He went to courtrooms and talked about the human consequences of corporate language. He resisted offering grand speeches. He shifted toward listening sessions where small business owners could speak of the invisible costs of their losses. Chloe, who had once worn grief like armor, let the peonies on her table move more often, sometimes by the bed where their daughter read, sometimes by the community center notice board where a workshop flyer hung. The daughter's vision had not made their past vanish, but it had provided them with a shape to work toward. Not redemption as spectacle, but redemption as practice. Friends who had once seen Lucas as the untouchable figure noticed the change. It was not immediate, nor was it clean. There were slips, old bosses who expected him to use influence in ways that had become uncomfortable. There were nights when the fear of re-ruin sat heavy in his chest. Yet the pattern had shifted. He took on an apprenticeship of accountability that meant public missteps were followed by private correction and an insistence on sustained effort. As the years unfurled, the family made room for people they had once only encountered as numbers in reports. They hosted a small fair in a neighborhood that had once lost half its storefronts, and Lucas stood in line to hand out hot dogs next to someone whose life she had once feared would end under his decisions. He learned to be surprised by the relief in being quietly useful. Chloe taught business classes at evening sessions and always began by setting a pot of tea and keeping an extra seat open at the head of the table for whoever needed it. There were times when remorse throbbed like an old injury, when Chloe would say a name aloud and then look away, or when Lucas would find himself tracing the outline of a chess piece and remembering the moves he had once favored. But the little girl's vision had done what simple truth rarely does. It demanded work and gave them a language to begin. "We are learning how to be gentle," they said often to each other, not as a mantra, but as a measurement. And in the quiet, when the city beyond their windows blinked like a horizon of small fires, Lucas would move the ivory knight to protect a pawn on the board, and he would set a vase of peonies beside it. Both acts small, both acts of practice. He was not absolved by a child's image, nor by a public essay, nor by the legal forms that had once made agreements tidy. He had been made new in a way that required repetition. Confession without performance, restitution without spectacle, presence without calculation. When their daughter grew beyond the child who had spoken of fields and peonies into someone who asked complicated questions about fairness and mercy, Lucas found that the most important thing he could teach her was the language of accountability. He taught her to listen to people whose worlds had been reduced by decisions that seemed abstract to most. He taught her that power was easiest to lose and hardest to wield well. On the anniversary of the surgery, the three of them, the small woman who had once worn grief, and the man who had learned to be quiet, and the daughter who had seen something that changed them, went to sit by a community garden they had helped fund. She picked a peony, handed it to her mother, and then to her father. Lucas took it carefully, like it was a fragile report of the life he had now elected to steward. The peony was a small living thing that bore the weight of memory, grief, restitution, and a child's improbable tenderness. They did not pretend their story had been simple. They allowed the names of those who had been hurt to be spoken and paid. They allowed themselves to remain present to the ache beneath the reparation. But they had been changed by the work they chose to do and by a small voice that had, during a moment of fear, offered them a direction. The message was not proof, it was a mirror. And it reflected back what they had wanted to become all along, a family that would be gentle by practice, not by proclamation. The city held its usual noises, sirens, distant laughter, the hum of trains. Inside their apartment, the chessboard had fewer pieces now, broken by games and life, yet the peonies on the table bloomed steady, unshowy. Lucas, who had once bet on everything, had learned to bet on nothing more dramatic than being present. It was the longest gamble he had ever taken, and, in the end, the one that mattered most. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like more stories like this, subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new uploads. Thank you for staying with us. Days folded into seasons with a kind of attentive predictability. Chloe learned to keep the mail sorted by color, bills in a neat stack, invitations in another, the small envelopes from people who mattered in another. Lucas learned to answer without rehearsing. Their daughter grew taller and more blunt, her questions sharpened by the classroom and the books she borrowed from the neighborhood library. She wanted to know about fairness in real terms. Who sat at what table? Who decided which blocks received streetlights and which were left dark? Why some banks closed and others stayed open? They answered as honestly as they could, not with theories, but with the stories of the people they'd seen and the names they had carried. One late autumn afternoon, a man arrived at the door who had not been expected. He wore a gray jacket with the faint, neat smell of another city. He introduced himself as someone who had once worked under Lucas, years earlier, before the quiet, before the classes, before the tea and the peonies, and the way his voice held? Both caution and calculation made Lucas set his cup down. "I heard you were doing community work," the man said, looking past Lucas to the daughter who had stopped for homework and now watched with an expression that had become familiar in strangers, half curiosity, half measurement. "There are opportunities, contracts, you know how to move them." Lucas's first impulse, the one he had practiced out of existence, was to explain competence, as if it were an alibi. But he had learned to let a silence do the work of a sentence. He remembered the chessboard on the table, the way he had moved the knight to protect a pawn. He thought of the peony in his hands, and how the bloom required tending rather than boasts. "We're not interested," he said simply. The man blinked. The jacket hesitated with the draft, as if reconsidering how to fold itself around disappointment. "I mean," Lucas added, softer, "not in that way." The man smiled with a memory of old bargains. "Of course, there's always a line to cross. Folks like you don't forget how to make something work, if you change your mind." Lucas closed the door without saying what he had almost said, that he had already changed his mind years ago, and that the change was not a transaction, but a slow, private tending. He could have imagined the conversation 100 different ways, the quick whisper, the polite decline, the ledger opened and closed. But instead, he returned to the kitchen and found Chloe had begun boiling water for the evening tea. "Did he offer a board seat?" she asked, without looking up, as though she already knew. "He offered a thing I used to want," Lucas said, and his voice had the lightness of an admission. Chloe handed him a cup. Their daughter pushed herself up from the table and moved a knight without saying anything. The temptation never left, of course. It lurked in the shape of convenience, funding that required silence, influence that required assent,
favors that required forgetting. Sometimes it entered as a phone call Lucas didn't take. Sometimes it arrived as an envelope that tempted the hand. But the architecture of their lives had changed. Obligations now were mostly to people who came to community meetings and expected to be heard, to faces they had come to know by the names they preferred, to the tiny ledger of trust that had been built with apology and with payment. At night, Lucas sometimes walked the block alone. He found comfort in ordinary streets, the laundromat's humming, the bakery window fogged with early bread, a dog that insisted on recognizing everyone. On such walks, he would see the places where his decisions had once landed like small, precise catastrophes. An empty storefront that now housed a childcare cooperative, a boarded-up clinic whose roof had been mended by a patchwork of grants and fundraisers. He told himself that repair was an act of patience rather than pride. The repairs did not call for a ribbon cutting. They asked for follow-through. Chloe's work became a kind of magnet for people who needed tools. Her evening classes swelled and thinned with seasons. Sometimes she taught budgeting and sometimes negotiation, sometimes the particular language of small business law, and sometimes simply how to say no to a person who promised quick returns in exchange for moral quiet. She always kept an extra seat at the head of the table, not as a gesture that would be quoted, but for the person who might otherwise be left standing. Their daughter, meanwhile, began a project at school that required her to interview local business owners. She would come home with notebooks full of precise shorthand, names, favorite pastries, the reasons a shopkeeper had stayed when so many others left. From her, she learned the language that mattered most, the language of listening. She also learned to be impatient with excuses. She questioned Lucas about the harder things with an earnestness that sometimes made him flinch. "How do you apologize to a whole block?" she asked once, folding her hands as if ordaining the question. "You don't apologize to a block," Lucas answered, because he could not straight up say what he felt. "You apologize to people. You keep apologizing. You keep showing up." She looked at him, and then, after a pause, wrote something in her notebook. Apologize equals repeat. The family's presence in the neighborhood was not universally welcome. There were evenings when someone left a note under the door, curt, uninviting, and mornings when the window glass by the gallery had been smeared with an accusation written in a hurried hand. The daughter learned, in small increments, that loving a place was not the same as being loved by it. Chloe learned that care often required anonymity, piling sandbags during a storm, quietly replacing a cracked window, sending checks that merely arrived with no explanatory letter. The world beyond their immediate neighborhood still turned with all its old incentives. There were articles they couldn't control, echoes of their past that resurfaced when a former colleague with a louder voice chose to speak of them in public. Sometimes the media's curiosity felt like a bell that clanged at irregular intervals, calling them to reckon once more with the ledger. When an investigative piece came out that named names and recounted old decisions, a cluster of neighbors assembled at their doorstep, some to offer condolences in a way that looked like support, others to ask for specifics. Lucas and Chloe answered with the same posture, not to erase, but to explain what had been done and what remained. On one such evening, a woman arrived who had run a small diner in a damaged strip, and whose business had shuttered during the years when decisions were easier to make than to reverse. She had come to the community garden earlier that summer to see what had grown there, and the daughter had given her a peony, because no one needed more. A reason to give a living thing away. Now she stood in front of the apartment building with a folded list of dates and invoices. "I need to know what you will do now that they have written it up," she said. Her voice had the metallic edge of someone practiced in keeping the world moving forward despite loss. "I need to know there is more than talk." Lucas looked at Chloe. He felt the old pattern. He could find a way to fix the exact thing, a single solution that would read well and buy silence, but he had learned the cost of such purchases. Instead, he invited the woman in for tea. They sat at the kitchen table, the daughter's homework forgotten on the side, and Lucas listened as if the list were a map rather than an indictment. When at last he spoke, his answers were not promises to erase the past, but plans to continue the work. A small emergency fund, an advisory board that would include the woman herself, regular public accounting of what the family committed to do and how it was done. It won't fix what was, Chloe said at one point, touching the woman's hand, but it can mean something like repair. The woman didn't accept everything at once. She didn't dissolve into gratitude. Repair had to prove itself, but she stayed. And later, as she left, she tucked a peony into her jacket, and the daughter watched the exchange and understood, in a way that had nothing to do with words, that mending was always provisional. Months passed. The daughter turned 16 and asked, bluntly, if she could organize a neighborhood fair that would feature the small businesses and give a platform to artists who had no stage. "You can do it," Chloe said, but the daughter's eyes narrowed. She wanted Lucas's endorsement more than anyone else's. He sat with the papers she brought and went through budgets and lists and permits, not to perform authority, but to teach how to steward responsibility. He insisted she consult the people she wanted to help rather than planning for them. She did. She knocked on doors, carried plates of soup to owners, listened to grudges and stories of survival. When she came home late one evening, smelling of frying oil in the city, she collapsed on the couch and said, "Some people said they wouldn't come because of your name." Her voice was steady, and there was pain folded into it. Lucas put his hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll make room for those who will." He thought of the peonies, of how some blossoms unfurl only when conditions were right. You can't control who forgives, you can only keep inviting them to the table. The fair that autumn was modest and imperfect. A gust near dusk upended a banner and sent pies tumbling, and a debate over noise curfew nearly ended a performance early, and someone miscounted tickets. Yet the small triumphs were what? A teenager selling pastries who had once slept in a shelter, now taking home more money than she had in months. An elderly man from a nearby block who had never spoken to his neighbors, teaching a line of children how to make paper stars. A woman who had once demanded legal fees, accepting an offer to sit on the advisory board because she was tired of being sidelined. Where there had once been a simple ledger, lines of credit and debit that had moral weight, there was now a messy, human accrual of trust. It was slower. It was noisy. It did not come with guarantees. But it persisted. On the night the fair closed, Lucas walked the route of the booths, listening to laughter and thank yous. A child tugged his sleeve and asked him to play chess. He sat on a folding chair under a street lamp and played for a while, losing patiently, winning less often than in the years he had been sharper at strategy. When the daughter approached with 2 cups of tea, she handed him one and said, without ceremony, "You keep practicing." "We all do," he answered. The peonies on their table at home were now mostly gone, spent after their burst of color, but a few late buds remained, promising another season. He placed his mug beside them and thought, not of absolution, but of tending, of the small, repeated acts that till to life. Near midnight, he heard the distant rumble of a truck and the low hum of radio from somewhere down the block. He thought of the man in the gray jacket and how his world still circulated with offers. He thought of his daughter and of all the questions she would have when the world next presented a ledger. He thought of the woman from the diner and how repairs asked for time. He did not sleep well that night. He did not sleep like someone who had finished with consequence. There was a residual unease in his chest, not the old sharp thrill of being dared toward a risk, but a softer, tethered worry, whether repeated small decencies would be enough. In the morning, a letter arrived, stamped and folded in a hand that had been familiar years before. He opened it at the sink as Chloe arranged a fresh pot of tea. The handwriting contained a name that once had been his refrain, someone whose life he had impacted by choices made in a room without witnesses. The lines inside were careful, neither litigious nor naive, and they asked for a meeting. Not for retribution, but for a conversation. Lucas read the letter twice, folded it back into its envelope, and walked over to the chessboard. The daughter was at the window, sketching layouts for the next season's garden. He moved his knight to the square that guarded his queen, then took it back, thoughtful. "I have to go," he said to Chloe. She nodded without surprise. "Will you tell her where?" "You're going?" He looked at their daughter, saw the sketchbook, the patient freckle on her chin, the way she held her pencil like a small sword. "No," he said, and the answer was not a secret, but a lesson. "I'll tell you both when I'm ready. But I'm taking the list you made of what the fair raised and the names of the people who asked for help. If I'm going to speak, I want it to be with something to show." Chloe squeezed his hand, the gesture a practiced pact. "Be quiet when you need to be," she said. "Be honest when you can." He pocketed the letter and left with the sound of the kettle still faint on the stove. Outside, the city had a clear, brittle air. The daughter watched him go, and then, after a moment, shut the door and turned, sketching again, as if the act of making might be the only prayer she could offer. Lucas walked toward a building below the gray ribbon of sky, carrying both the old invitation and the new list. The streets still smelled of exhaust and roasted chestnuts. A man played a trumpet on the corner with the patient slur of someone who had long ago learned the value of repetition. When Lucas reached the threshold of the place the letter named, he paused, feeling the familiar hum of decision. He had rehearsed apologies in his head 1,000 times over the years. Now he would offer them in the raw. He would not promise miracles, he would bring proofs of work and the willingness to sit and listen. He felt the old hunger for easy resolutions still there, but thinner, as if worn down by time and tending. The door opened, and the person who had written the letter stepped forward. There was no drama, no raised voices, no shattering of silence. Just two people who had once been positioned as predator and prey, now obligated to live in the same city, responsible to the same community, and to each other. They sat in a small room that had seen other kinds of reconciliations. A child on the windowsill watching pigeons, papers on a table, a heater that clunked like a tired heart. Lucas set down his list. He did not begin with excuses. He began with names. "I have come to listen," he said. The other person looked at him with a slow, careful gaze. "Then start," they replied. Outside, a late peony clung to its stem, a stubborn promise against the coming frost. Inside, two people made the first of many exchanges that would not be neat, that would sometimes be ugly, that would require the same daily return the family had learned to practice. When Lucas left the meeting hours later, the light had changed to the brittle blue that comes before winter. He walked home with the list lighter at his side and a sense that the work had only just begun. He rehearsed nothing. He only moved as he had learned to from one small thing to the next. At the door, their daughter met him with a single question. "Did you listen?" He swallowed the answer like a piece of bread. "I listened," he said, "and I will keep listening." She smiled, not triumphant, but satisfied, in the way a child finishes a difficult puzzle. Chloe took his coat and placed a hand on his shoulder. They did not make a show of anything. The peony on the table had a new bud. Outside, the city breathed its usual uncertain breath. They had not arrived. They had not been absolved. They continued. They had learned the grammar of repair. Small verbs repeated. In the corner, the chessboard waited for another game. Lucas sat down and moved a pawn forward, not for grand strategy, but for the simple reason that practice, practiced over time, becomes a way of life. The next day would hold more questions. The neighborhood would need more tending. Old offers, old temptations would continue to glint in the periphery. But as they settled to supper, and the daughter told a story about a vendor who had finally laughed at a joke she had told, Lucas understood that the long and difficult part of his life had become a kind of fidelity. To show up, to listen, to repair where he could, and to live with the consequences where he could not. The work continued, and that, now, was something like hope. Morning came thin and bright. Lucas made tea without hurry, watched steam lift like something forgiven. The daughter spread her sketches on the table. Chloe folded a sweater and hummed as she moved through small necessary tasks. They spoke in the language of habit, questions with room for honest answers, promises measured in minutes. He pinned the list to the corkboard by the door and added a single new name, one more neighbor who had asked for timber to mend a stoop. He stepped outside with his coat and his cautious steadiness, ready for another ordinary errand that, in time, might become repair enough. The city kept its steady breathing.
They kept their work.